you know, the story behind Phaeton. He was the son of Helios, but didn't know he was the son. And then he was coming of age, and he asked his mother, he was in class, and everybody was bragging about their father. And he was upset because he didn't know who his father was. So he goes to his mother and convinces her to tell him about his father. And at that point, she says, that, your father is none other than the sun god. So then he resolves that he's going to go and find his father, which after arduous travels, he gets to the gates of the sun, and his father welcomes him and is overjoyed to see him. And among the Greek gods, while they are immune to most of the rules and restrictions that affect us mere mortals, and though they are basically immortal, nonetheless they are bound by certain restrictions. And one of those is that if a god makes a promise, he can't go back on it.
Right.
So Helios then is so glad to see Phaeton that he says, "I'll grant you any boon, anything you ask for." So then Phaeton says, "Well, okay, Dad, I want to drive your chariot." To which Helios goes, "Well, wait a minute. No, I meant anything but that. I mean, you can have anything else, not that, though, not that." And he goes and tries to talk Phaeton out of it.
Yeah.
Well, Phaeton is bound and determined. He's not going to give up. He wants to drive his dad's chariot, right? So Helios says, "Suppose I should lend you the chariot. What would you do? Could you keep your course while the sphere was revolving under you? Perhaps you think that there are forests and cities, the abodes of gods, and the palaces and temples on the way. On the contrary, the road is through the midst of frightful monsters. You pass by the horns of the bull, in front of the archer, and near the lion's jaws, and where the scorpion stretches its arms in one direction, the crab in another." So obviously he's describing the zodiac.
Yeah.
Because this is obviously the normal path of the sun. You're going through the sign of the zodiac. But finally he relinquishes. Phaeton gets in the chariot, starts driving it, and immediately the great steeds realize whoever's got these reins doesn't know what he's doing. Chariot spins out of control. Phaeton starts freaking out. Then Bullfinch's account goes on. He says, "When hapless Phaeton looked down upon the earth, now spreading in vast extent beneath him, he grew pale and his knees shook with terror. In spite of all the glare around him, the sight of his eyes grew dim. He wished he had never touched his father's horses, never learned his parentage, never prevailed in his request. He is borne along like a vessel that flies before a tempest, and when the pilot can do more and betakes himself to prayers, he turns his eyes from one direction to the other, now to the goal whence he began his course, now to the realms of sunset, which he is not destined to reach. He sees with terror the monstrous forms scattered over the surface of heaven. Here the scorpion extended his two great arms, with his tail and crooked claws stretching over two signs of the zodiac. When the boy beheld him, reeking with poison and menacing with his fangs, his courage failed, and the reins fell from his hands. The horses, when they felt them loose on their backs, dashed headlong and unrestrained went off into unknown regions of the sky, in among the stars, hurling the chariot over pathless places, now up into heaven, now down almost to earth." And this is a very intriguing, interesting line here. "The moon saw with astonishment her brother's chariot running beneath her own."
Of course.
Sure. So what we've got here, the chariot is now a metaphor for the comet, the asteroid. I'm presuming it's, in this case, a comet, probably, passing within the orbit of the moon.
Right.
Right?
That's what it sounds like.
That's what it sounds like to me, yep. So then what happens once it gets inside the orbit of the moon? The clouds begin to smoke and the mountaintops take fire. The fields are parched with heat. The plants wither, the trees with their leafy branches burn, the harvest is ablaze. But these are small things. Great cities perished with their walls and towers, whole nations with their people consumed to ashes. The forest-clad mountains burned, with fires within and without, and Parnassus with his 2 peaks, and Rhodope forced at last to part with his snowy crown, right? So the glaciers have melted. Her cold climate was no protection to Scythia. Caucasus burned, and Ossa and Pindus, and greater than both, Olympus, the Alps, high in air. Then Phaeton beheld the world on fire, and felt the heat intolerable. The air he breathed was like the air of a furnace and full of burning ashes, and the smoke was of a pitchy darkness. He dashed forward, he knew not whither. The Libyan desert was dried up to the condition in which it remains to this day. The nymph of the fountains, with disheveled hair, mourned their waters, nor were the rivers safe beneath their banks. The earth cracked open, and through the chinks light broke into Tartarus, and frightened the king of shadows and his queen. The sea shrank up. Where before was water, it became a dry plain, and the mountains that lie beneath the waves lifted up their heads and became islands. The fishes sought the lowest depths, and the dolphins no longer ventured as to sport on the surface. Even Nereus and his wife Doris with their Nereids, their daughters, sought the deepest caves for refuge. Thrice Neptune essayed to raise his head above the surface, and thrice was driven back by the heat. Earth, surrounded as she was by waters, yet with head and shoulders bare, screening her face with her hand, looked up to heaven, and with a husky voice called on Jupiter, "O ruler of the gods, if I have deserved this treatment, and it is your will that I perish with fire, why withhold your thunderbolts? Let me at least fall by your hand. Is this the reward for my fertility of my obedient servants?" And it goes on with this entreaty to heaven. So then I'm jumping ahead. Thus spoke Earth, and overcome with heat and thirst could say no more. Then Jupiter, omnipotent, calling to witness all the gods, including him who had lent the chariot, and showing them all that all was lost unless some speedy remedy were applied, mounted the lofty tower from whence he diffuses clouds over the earth and hurls his forked lightnings. But at that time not a cloud was to be found to interpose for a screen to earth, nor was a shower remaining unexhausted. He thundered, and brandishing a lightning bolt in his right hand, launched it against the charioteer, and struck him at that same moment from his seat and from existence. Phaeton, with his hair on fire, fell headlong like a shooting star, which marks the heavens with its brightness as it falls. And Eridanus, the great river, received him and cooled his burning frame. So there's right there, he brings in the metaphor, the long hair. The comet means long-haired, right? Like his hair on fire. He's a meteor shower, right? Which, of course, is the byproduct of a comet. And then, in variations of the myth, the sisters of Phaeton were the not the Pleiades, the who are the sisters? Sisters, who?
The twins? I don't know.
No, sisters of Phaeton.
No, asking the wrong guys.
Oh, I thought you guys aren't accomplished classic scholars.
I know how to
about the flooding waters.
Yeah, because his sisters, the Phaeton's sister.
What's the part about the thunderbolt though? Like, I know that a thunderbolt was also what they would call sometimes an object coming in that was also called a thunderbolt.
I've always taken that to mean that it's the space debris itself. I mean, there's a whole thunderbolts now that I have to study into the dealing with the idea that they're electrical discharges, and there certainly are possible electrical discharges from objects entering the Earth's atmosphere. Here, it's basically Jupiter saves the Earth by
Yeah.
hurling a thunderbolt and knocking this thing out. Right?
Wasn't Wasn't there something with the Sphinx and how I'm trying to remember the details on this, but there's an old Egyptian story that the Sphinx was hit by a thunderbolt, and that one of the pharaohs came to see it later, implying that it was an actual object that had landed.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that story.
Okay, yeah, it's always is implied to be. Sorry, go ahead.
The Heliades, those were Phaeton's sisters. The Heliades.
Okay.
That's it. Heliades. So then a variant on the story goes that his sisters, after his death, his sisters were so grief-stricken that they wept. And their tears then fell to earth and drowned the world in the great flood.
Oh, of course.
So in that variation, then there's this, obviously, a connection then between an object, this cosmic object setting the earth on fire, followed by a great flood, which is pretty much the scenario now that's emerged from studies of the Younger Dryas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Phaethusa and Limpedia.
Those are the Heliades?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But I just read something else where it was like the tears of the daughters of Helios are amber.
Mm-hmm.
So they make jewelry out of the amber, and it's
yeah, that's an interesting twist, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have a screen share here to do Sebastiano in 1703. His painting here of the Fall of Phaeton. There it is.
So we're going through the myth of Phaeton because in Plato's dialogues,
yes,
the old Egyptian priest referenced it when he was talking to Solon.
That's exactly right. And so this myth is actually the preface to the Atlantis story.
Right.
And that's why we are dwelling on it. And I think there's an important reason why Plato prefaced the story with the myth of Phaeton. I mean, I think he's right at the outset. He's wanting you to tie in the idea of a cosmic encounter with the idea of the destruction of Atlantis.
Is that Jupiter up there with his thunderbolt on the upper right?
Yeah, let's see. There you go. Yep, Jupiter hurling his thunderbolt, and you see Phaeton falling, the chariot here, the great steeds is plunging to earth. But this one by Gustave Moreau I find to be really interesting. Notice here now,
yep.
You've got the zodiacal wheel here, and there's the lion, obviously Leo, and we see the chariot plunging to earth, and we see a great dark serpent rising up from the earth.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an interesting detail. But then, almost as if to clinch it, look what you got here in the background.
Right, I saw that.
Yeah. Now, notice, cusp of Leo, 12,900 years ago.
Right.
That's the black mat layer date, right?
And it's also either the sunrise or the sun. That's the sun back there, isn't it?
That's the sun back there, I would assume, yeah.
Yeah.
Unless it's the moon rising.
Could be the moon.
Could be the moon. But so you have the great dragon, you've got the lion, you've got the chariot, you've got the comet, all in this composition. So what did Gustave Moreau know?
Yeah.
Well, Gustave Moreau, interestingly, was very much studied into mythology, occult traditions. He was also well-versed in astronomy. So he was an artist that could have had access to more insider interpretations of some of the tales and myths. So then the priests go on, after invoking the myth of Phaeton and the consequences of that kind of an event, they go on to say that when this happens, those who live upon the mountains and in dry and lofty places are more liable to destructions than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity, the Nile, who is our never-failing Savior, saves and delivers us. When, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, among you herdsmen and shepherds on the mountains are the survivors, whereas those of you who live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. The fact is that wherever the extremity of winter frost or of summer sun does not prevent, the human race is always increasing at times, and at other times diminishing in numbers. And whatever happened, either in your country or in ours, or in any other region of which we are informed, if any action which is noble or great or in any other way remarkable has taken place, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples, whereas you and other nations are just being provided with letters and other things. But then, at the usual period, the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and thus you have to begin all over again as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves.